Hey folks, in just a few days we have Season 8 of Battlegrounds starting. Actually Wednesday, May 24th is when the new season starts. So in advance of the new season starting, I wanted to get this video out to go over just a broad overview of how the season is going to operate in terms of some of the changes that are coming into rewards and progression, obviously the meta, my own thoughts on what's going to be most effective for people, how to succeed in this meta, and some specific review of champs and all the different classes that should be effective. So I know that both for myself as well as what I observed across the alliance that I'm in and just a lot of different chats that I'm in, interest was definitely down for Season 7 of Battlegrounds. A lot of reasons for that. I'm not going to go over them in detail. I think a lot of people have their own thoughts or have listened to other content creators give their thoughts. But I'm hoping that the reasons behind why Season 7 led to some decrease in interest, I think, is going to get turned around. Again, I already kind of hinted at, do have improvements to the progression path. We do have improvements to the rewards, and there is a promise. We'll see what comes of it, but there is a promise from Kabam that some of the stability problems that they had in season 7 are going to get addressed, or have already started being addressed. So anyway, let's go over some of the details. Again, there have been other videos that have gone over these changes for Season 8, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but just a broad overview. So first, the rewards changes, which are relatively modest at this point, but still very welcome. So we have 7-star shards that are being added to both the Gladiator Circuit rewards as well as the solo event. And then for the Alliance event, they're adding T6CC, they're adding T6B, and they're adding T3A. So anytime that rewards are being added, that's great. I think the more meaningful change is actually going to be not necessarily these reward updates, but they are promising that the store is going to be updated soon as well. Now, when exactly is soon, I don't know. Hopefully, hopefully it does happen during this season or maybe towards the end of this season. But in any case, between these actual changes that will be live for Season 8 and then the promised changes coming to the store, for those of us who like Battlegrounds, it should be a really meaningful increase to the rewards that we gain. All right, beyond that, there are the progression changes. A lot of people have complained about just the victory track being too long, the progression through the victory track being a little bit too punishing. They made in particular some changes to the way they did to their matchmaking algorithm in the victory track this past season, which weren't well received by everybody. I think many people felt like it was a little bit too punishing. My own perspective on that is that it seemed like what happened was smaller accounts used to have an easier time progressing through victory track. And the change was that as you get higher and higher through the victory track, those smaller accounts start running into more and more obstacles, meaning that roster strength starts mattering less and less the higher up you went in victory track. So if you're in bronze or silver, you're getting matched against similarly small accounts. When you get to platinum, diamond, you start, in the past, you would just be matched with similar strength accounts the whole way through. But now you're actually in platinum, diamond, getting matched up against monster accounts, and therefore it was a much bigger struggle for you to make it through those ranks. I don't know if they're actually going to change that aspect of the matchmaking algorithm. And in my own opinion, I know that some people found it punishing. I think they found it punishing because it was different from what they had gotten used to. I do think that this is a fairer way to go about matchmaking. It doesn't make sense for the entire victory track to be based purely on roster strength. Because the rewards still are, well, they were, and I think they still are going to be pretty sizable for making your way through the victory track. So in a way, you're kind of penalizing those people who have progressed their rosters if you keep roster strength as important as it was in seasons 1 through 6. But in any case, I promised that I wasn't going to spend too much time on this. Matchmaking may or may not change, but what is definitely changing is the progression. So previously, you had to just win a match to get a medal. If you lost a match, you lost that medal, and you needed somewhere between 2 and 5 medals to progress through any particular track, depending on where the progression you are. So the change now is that in most of the ranks, you're actually going to get 2 medals per win, not just 1. Whereas if you lose, it's still just you're getting 1 medal taken away from you. So it's now much, much easier to make your way through bronze and silver. That should be a breeze. That, bronze 2 and 1, you're really just needing 1 win to make it through. Silver ranks, it's basically 2 wins. And doesn't even have to be 2 wins in a row. It can be if you win 1, lose 1, and then win 1, you're through that rank. In gold, it's still easier, even though now it's 5 medals instead of the 3 that it was. Because of the 2 medals per win, it's still going to be easier because, obviously you can just win 3 in a row, in which case it's the same as it was before, but now you can win 2, you're up to 4 medals, lose 1, you're down to 3, and then win 1, you're up to 5, right? Or, you win 2, up to 4, you lose 2, you're down to 2, but then you win 2 more, now you're back through, right? So, this is the key complaint I think that people had, is that if you keep on win 1, lose 1, or win 2, lose 2, it felt like you're just stuck. Whereas all the way through gold, if you win 1, lose 1, or you win 2, lose 2, you're going to be able to make it all the way through. It actually doesn't stop at gold. That actually continues through platinum, and it's only at diamond that then it goes back to the way it's been in all the seasons up until now, where it's 3 medals to progress, up through diamond 1, then becomes 4, and then finally 5 to reach gladiator circuit. And you're only getting 1 medal per win, the same way it was. So should be a lot faster. I think it is also fairer. So maybe this helps make the change that they made to matchmaking last season a little bit more palatable for those people with smaller accounts who didn't like that change. We'll see. I think this is a win. All right. Enough of those changes. Let's focus on what should be the main topic for this video, which is the victory track meta. And I may make follow-up videos for the metas for gladiator circuit, but for right now I'm focused on victory track. It's not a very unusual meta, I guess I would say, in a couple different ways. One is that at least the first buff list of this masochism over time is one that most of us have seen before, mostly in war, right? So we had masochism for a long time, recently changed to masochism over time. So experience with this particular buff, even in story, quest content, variant content, this node has definitely appeared before, so people know how it works. And the other way in which it's familiar is that, well, just 2 seasons ago we had Conflictor, which is a very similar tactic. Basically, masochism is if a debuff is triggered, the defender gets regen. In Conflictor, it was if the debuff gets triggered, then the defender purifies and gets power. So, same thing, just regen instead of power. It's still a 7-second cooldown. It is 5% of the max health, right? Not base health. So for defenders, you are talking about, if it's a 200k health pool, that's 10k regen right there. Not insignificant, but also not terrifically punishing. And again, people have experience with it, so even though I'm going to go over some of the ways to deal with it, you already probably know, if you've been playing this game for a while, some of the strategies of how to deal with masochism. Now, buff 2 is interesting because when I first read it, I thought, well, okay, that's fine. It's not like it's meaningless, but it's a secondary. It felt to me like a secondary consideration. That masochism was definitely the much bigger consideration, and buff 2 was really just this kind of small tweak. And the more I thought about it, actually, I think it might be almost as important as buff 1, especially for a few particular defenders. But what it is basically it's just giving the defender complete immunity to regen rate modification. And I say complete immunity because I think many of us have seen nodes where regen rate can't be modified except for poison. This is complete immunity, so it doesn't matter if you're talking about poison, doesn't matter if you're talking about the Despair Mastery and people stacking up debuffs on the defender, doesn't matter if you're talking about some sort of effect that directly modifies regen rate, like Spectre. All these will have no effect on the regen rate of the defender. So the reason why I'm saying that it's, after some thought, it's more significant than I had at first assumed, is that there's a lot of defenders that have their own regen. And previously, the primary way that we would deal with those defenders would be, well, you reverse that regen. And now any reversal regen is completely out of the picture. So again, I'll go into some more details when we talk about specific champs, but I think there are a few champs that are going to be problematic because of their own regen, not just the regen that's coming from the Masochism over time node. And then finally, same note that we had last season, that they're trying to remote relics, so you start the match with your relic gauge at 50%. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about, before we get into the champs, some of the masteries that you might want to think about. And let me bring up my game here. And so going into masteries, I don't think it's going to require a massive build, but there's one obvious question that we'll deal with. First, a few of the smaller points to make. I already mentioned Despair. Since Despair is not going to have any effect, right? The point of Despair is that it reduces healing regen effects by 15%. If you're immune to regen rate modification, my understanding is that Despair is going to have no effect on the defender. So, I guess you could argue that if you're replacing defenders that place a lot of debuffs on the attacker, that you want to have Despair in place. But I think for most of us, if you had 3 points in this before, might as well take it down to 1 point. Or maybe even if you're not interested in Deep Wounds or Unfazed or Assassin, then maybe even just you can blank that tree out completely. All right, beyond Despair, the next interesting one is Recovery Mastery. So the point of the Recovery Mastery is that it's increasing your regen rate by 15%. What I don't know is this included when they talk about immunity to regen rate modification? Is recovery considered regen rate modification? My instinct tells me no, it's not going to be included, and recovery will still be applicable. But I don't know that for certain. If it turns out that recovery now has no effect on your defenders, again, you may still want it for your attackers, but potentially if you're interested in, let's say, running both Deep Wounds and Mystic Dispersion, right? Or looking for some other setup where you need every last mastery point, this might be a place where you can save points. Willpower. Even though willpower is based off of base health, because regen rate is no longer modifiable, and therefore extra willpower can't be used against you, I think it may be worth it to actually run max willpower. I know a lot of people run max willpower anyway all the time. I personally don't. I know a lot of people don't. If you're like me and you don't, it's worth considering maybe slap on max willpower. Inequity. Again, if the primary reason why you were running Inequity was for your attackers, and if this meta causes you to shy away from attackers that place a lot of debuffs, then obviously Inequity loses value, and that might be a place where you want to save points. In my own opinion, and I'll go over this again in more detail, I don't think you need to stay away from attackers that place a lot of debuffs. I think actually, in some cases, it can be to your advantage with the Masochism node to use attackers that place a lot of debuffs. But again, up to you. It depends somewhat on your roster, your playstyle. If you were running Inequity, and if the primary benefit was for your attackers, then it's a place to save points. Many people run it not just for their attackers, but also for their defenders. For example, Null. Null benefits a lot from Inequity because he places all those debuffs on the attacker at the start of the fight, and therefore lowers the attacker's strength. So if you have a lot of attackers like that, or you like to focus on maybe a few defenders in your deck that place a lot of debuffs, then again, that's another reason to keep Inequity. I don't think there's anything in the proficiencies tree that I really want to focus on. Mystic Dispersion will continue to be a must. Petrify Mastery, if you're running it, loses some value because, again, the regenerate modification, based on my understanding, Petrify will no longer be able to apply that regen rate reduction. But probably that's not, one, a very commonly run mastery, and two, if you are running it, maybe you're running it just for access to Pacify, or maybe you're also running it because you want to lower the combat power rate, which still is affected by Petrify. Okay, finally, I think the main point that needs to be made, and there is no definitive answer, at least I don't have one, is whether or not it makes sense to run recoil for this meta. Based on what I'm thinking, I think it could be useful, but I don't think it's essential. So I think it really depends on who your best attackers and defenders are, and do you want to construct a deck around those attackers and defenders that are going to be recoil friendly. Because there is room for it, right? There's an obvious benefit for your defenders in that with the Masochism node, the defender is automatically going to purify. I'm not sure if it's both debuffs, at least one debuff. It could be both, but I'd have to test that out. But in any case, there is at least some large mitigation of the primary downside to recoil, which is that damage lost to bleed and poison. So that's one reason to possibly think about running recoil. The second reason, and again, some of this will be clear as I go over some of the attackers that I'm expecting to be good, but there are some attackers who should be able to thrive in this meta who happen to be some of the most recoil-friendly champs in the game. So if you have all of those champs and you want to focus on a strategy centered around those champs, that may be another reason why you want to try out running recoil. I personally am probably generally not a recoil user. I will not start out the season running recoil, but I will have my eyes open to see what other people are doing and what kind of success they're having. And if it looks like, you know what, there is a advantage to be had by running recoil, then I'll switch. Okay, so I don't think there are any other masteries that I wanted to go over. So let's start talking about, just in broad strokes before talking about particular champs, what are the kinds of properties of attackers that you want to have in your deck? So very obvious one to start with. Again, if you've ever played Masochism, you kind of know about this, but any champs where you're having to frequently parry to stun the defender in order to get your opening, well, every 7 seconds, if that is the first debuff that's being encountered, that debuff is going to be purified, and you're going to have to reparry. You're going to have to wait for another opportunity to get an opening. So if you have an attacker that doesn't need that kind of opening, if they can create their own, whether it's because of they can go unstoppable, or they can phase, or there's a few other examples that I'll go over, but champs that can create their own openings are going to be valuable. Those champs that in some ways can either prevent or reduce the frequency of debuff purification, or in some ways, if when debuff purification happens, they can punish it. Meaning there are a few champs that will actually inflict some type of damage on the defender if the defender purifies a debuff. So I've hinted at this a little bit, so we'll start getting into more detail, right? That obviously if you have an attacker that doesn't place debuffs at all, isn't reliant on any debuffs beyond the simple parry stun, that's going to be to your advantage. But if the attacker is very frequently placing lots of debuffs, then if every 7 seconds one debuff happens to get purified here and there, that may not be a big deal, right? And that actually might be to your advantage, because that means that when you need a parry stun, it's more likely that it's going to stick because you probably already triggered Masochism from one of your other debuffs. And then finally, in this final subpoint is one that I think will frequently come up, and I'll reference as I'm going through champs, right? But there are a lot of champs that don't frequently place debuffs, but there are a few key moments in the fight where they do need to place a debuff, right? For their L2 to really have maximum damage, you need to be able to place a debuff, right? If there's only a few moments you need to focus on, then you can just make sure, well, let me parry stun before I do that L2 or before I execute that other action where I'm going to need that debuff to stick. 7 seconds is usually long enough that you can focus on getting that parry stun and then executing the action. Fourth one is a pretty obvious one, heal block, right? If you can keep the defender reliably heal blocked, then you don't have to care as much about the fact that Masochism is triggering that regen. And then finally, I'm not sure how often this is going to come into play, but theoretically it is a regen buff. So if you can nullify that buff, if you can neutralize it from even happening in the first place, maybe if you can stagger it, although stagger itself is usually a debuff, so I'm not sure if that's really going to be practical. But nullifies and neutralizers, it is a 7-second long buff, so there is some opportunity to nullify before it's reached its maximum value, or neutralizing, obviously, preventing it from proccing in the first place is going to have some value. So that's attackers. As far as defenders, there's not really a lot specific that I'm going to go over. I think the defenders that are going to be good are largely the defenders that are good in any meta. However, beyond just having a big health pool, right? The bigger your health pool is, the more that the bigger nominal value of that region that's getting procced off of Masochism, because it's 5% of max health. But having your own regen, I mentioned before that maybe that regen rate modification immunity is actually pretty significant, maybe just as significant as Masochism. There are some defenders that we all know about. I'll go over some of the specifics, but those defenders that have significant regen on their own, a lot of times the way that we deal with them is by reversing that regen. And if that avenue is no longer available to you, those defenders become a lot stronger. Any defenders that, beyond the Masochism node, they have their own mechanism for purifying debuffs, well, that's just going to make it that much harder for people to get that stun to stick, right? There's a lot of people out there that are very heavily reliant on parry in order to be able to play as well as they can, right? And so the more that you can take that away from them, the better that you'll do. And then this is probably a smaller point, right? But as I mentioned before, if a good attacker includes those who can nullify or neutralize that regen buff from the Masochism, well, correspondingly, if you have a defender that is nullify immune or can't be neutralized, that's to your advantage. All right, enough blather about generalities. Let's start getting into some of the specifics of which champs I think are really going to be effective. I'm not going to go over every champ that I have highlighted here. I have highlighted the champs that in general I think are going to be ones that you'd want to include in your deck. Some of them are going to be fairly obvious. Others are just, it's not really anything particular to the meta. It's just that, well, they're strong and therefore they continue to be strong in this meta. But I think one case that's useful to point out when it comes to the science class, and actually maybe I'll talk about two champs at once, right? We have OG Hulk, and then we also have Joe Fixit. So OG Hulk is someone who does rely on debuffs, right? He does have those, I forget exactly what they're called, some sort of vulnerability debuff that is placed off of the L2, and then obviously there's the massive stun that comes off of the L1. So even though it's a lot of debuffs being placed by Hulk on the L2, because they're all placed at once, I'm pretty sure what Masochism does is it's actually going to basically eliminate all of those debuffs at once. So you're placing whatever number, I forget what it is, but 15 vulnerability debuffs at once, all of them get eliminated by Masochism. So because I mentioned before, if you're placing debuffs just at a key moment in the fight, right? So if it's really just these two moments for Hulk that you need to worry about, the L2 and the L1, then you can just make sure, well, I'll parry before I throw my L2 to make sure those vulnerability debuffs stick, right? And I'll parry before my L1 to make sure that the big stun from my L1 sticks. I think that's going to be an effective strategy. On the other hand, Joe Fixit is someone who also places a lot of debuffs, but the debuffs aren't all placed at the same time. So if he fires off his L1, it's placing whatever number 6, 7 bleed debuffs, for example, but in quick succession. It's not 7 instantaneous, simultaneous debuffs. So in his case, you don't have to be as, I guess, attentive to trying to make sure you parry before you throw the L1, because, you know, the first debuff doesn't stick. That's fine. The rest of them will. So again, interesting case. 2 champs that place lots of debuffs and are reliant on those debuffs, who both can be effective for slightly different reasons, and those reasons have an impact on how you're going to want to play them. Beyond that, Torch, you know, with his pre-fight, the passives, not much worrying about. Mr. Negative will continue to be effective. You just have to parry before the L2 degen that you place. Quicksilver places lots of debuffs. If a Whiplash here and there gets eaten, that's fine. Red Hulk isn't dependent. Scorpion is similar to Quicksilver. Too many debuffs that you can lose 1 or 2. Spider Ham, I'm not sure about. You know, it's a similar kind of case as Scorpion, right? That he places a good number of debuffs, but it's not quite as often as Scorpion, right? I think it's only 50% chance, although it is a higher chance when the defender is stunned, but still. You're not going to be placing them quite as often, and I believe that when the poppers get reapplied, then they get reapplied all at once, and therefore then you have a possibility that they're all going to be eaten. So I think he could still be effective, especially as a defender, but may not be as effective as an attacker as he is in some other metas. Spot, some of those debuffs are going to get eaten. I think he'll still have plenty of firepower. Overseer does have a lot of debuffs, right? He does have the Disorient on the L2, the, what does he have on the L1? A stun. He has a taunt on his heavy, but none of those are really essential to his playstyle. You know, the taunt is nice, but actually the taunt usually, assuming that your heavy is coming off of a parry, is going to stick. But most of his damage comes off of the whatever it's called, the cosmic mode that he goes into, and then the buffs that he gets off of his gamma rage. So he'll continue to be a very strong attacker. Thane will be a fine defender. Void I threw in there, just skipping around a little bit. Void will be good because I do expect there are going to be people out there running recoil, in which case you want to have Void in your decks. You can give them a very problematic defender to deal with. And then Titania, again, someone who procs lots of debuffs, just make sure you parry before you throw your L3. All right, moving on to the skill class. Atuma, I'm not necessarily saying that he's a great attacker or defender, but if he's someone that you like, well, you'll probably continue to like him in this meta. There's not really any way that he is negatively affected by these nodes. Zemo, I think, is going to be possibly a big danger. I don't know a lot about Zemo, but just a quick read through his abilities. He does, I think, get a big Fury buff, a very large Fury buff, anytime the defender purifies one of his debuffs. So if that's going to be happening frequently, you know, beyond just his own abilities because of the node, he's someone to watch out for. He might be a must ban for those who don't have him. I don't have him. Black Cat does throw a lot of debuffs. I think she'll be fine. You know, if you wanna get the sabotage, then you'll just have to make sure you parry before the heist ends. Black Panther is not someone I play a lot, but I think he throws enough bleeds that he'll be fine. Black Widow Deadly Origin, lots of debuffs that she's throwing. If 1 or 2 get eaten, it's fine. Same deal with Blade. Blade, I think, you know, again, given the resurgence of dimensional beings, is going to be good to have in your deck. He is one of the few attackers, and it's possible my understanding is flawed, but I believe that he's one of the few attackers that when Danger Sense is activated, he's not just reducing the defensive ability accuracy of the defender, he's also reducing the offensive ability accuracy of the defender. And the Masochism is considered an offensive ability attached to the defender. So, if Danger Sense is active, I believe that means that Blade will be able to bypass Masochism, whatever percentage it is, I think 40% of the time. Crossbones, so Crossbones, it's good to, I guess, draw this contrast that Crossbones is obviously also an ability accuracy reducer, but he does not reduce offensive ability accuracy of the defender. So he will not be able to bypass Masochism. But that being said, he's not really overly reliant on parry stuns, at least the way that I play him, so he should be totally fine. Has that incinerate on the L2, just parry before you throw the L2. Falcon, similar story, he'll be as effective as he usually is, doesn't really rely on debuffs. He has the bleeds on his L1s, but probably for the most part you're not relying on that. His lock-on is passive. And once again, his lock-on does not reduce the offensive ability accuracy of the defender. Hitmonkey will continue to be a nuke. Kate Bishop, I don't know much about her. I do understand that her, at least some of her arrow effects are passive, so I believe she should still continue to be effective. Killmonger's defensive value may actually be a little bit higher in this meta than it usually is, because one of the ways that people deal with Killmonger is by armor breaking him. And so if it's a little bit harder with Masochism to actually get those armor breaks to stick, then Killmonger's value goes up a little bit. On the other hand, I think Kingpin's value as an attacker comes down a little bit. One of the things that people depend on with, or they count on with Kingpin is his ability to lower ability accuracy. And they do that via the L1 degen, which is a debuff. So if that debuff is now a little bit less likely to stick, again, there are ways around it, but I do think that he loses a little bit of value as an attacker. Still worth including in your deck, definitely. Korg will continue to be a killer. I think Mantis, again, another champ that I don't have. What I understand is that the bulk of her rotation doesn't really depend on placing debuffs. There is an Infuriate or Intimidate, or possibly both, that you may want to place it at some points. So you'll have to be careful with that. But otherwise, I think her rotation is largely unaffected. Sakura, yeah, is a Disorient or a Incinerate may get eaten. It's not really going to affect his rotation much, I don't think. Moman will be able to create his own openings with his Unstoppable. I think he'll be very effective. Nick Fury, his offensive value goes down a little bit. Most people rely on him for defense, but if you did rely on him for offense, with some of his bleeds getting eaten, it's going to have an impact on him. He wasn't the fastest attacker to begin with, and it's going to just make him slightly less effective. But still, I'm definitely going to run him in my deck. Shang-Chi should be very, very effective. He can create his own openings with the MLLM attack, and obviously he can be a nuke. Valkyrie is not reliant on debuffs. She'll be totally fine. Onto the mutant class. So APOC is, for those who have been playing the game for a while, you probably know very well that APOC is the classic Masochism counter. His debuffs cannot be purified. That being said, for Battlegrounds, he's never been the fastest attacker. That's not going to change here. So, he still has a lot of defensive value. Theoretically has some addition to offensive value. I still think that it's probably a desperation play rather than something that you want to count on often. Archangel definitely is going to be a little bit trickier. Some of his bleeds may get eaten, which is going to impact your ability to actually get those Neros up. Not just bleeds, but also the poisons. That being said, he places them often enough that I think it's going to extend the fight a little bit, but you'll still be okay. He'll still be a powerhouse. And additionally, he's another champ that does, my understanding is, reduce all ability accuracy, not just defensive ability accuracy, via his Neros if you have him duped. So get a few Neros up, and then you can stop worrying about the Masochism node. Bishop's a good case. Bishop doesn't really rely hugely on debuffs for the most part. If you're, obviously if you're running the L1, or if you're counting on the L1, well, there's a lot of debuffs there. But if you're just looking for the L2 for that big damage, just make sure that you parry before the L2. Additionally, he's one of the attackers that I alluded to as far as punishing purification. So anytime the defender purifies one of his debuffs, he inflicts, I think, energy damage. I forget if it's direct damage or energy damage, but he does inflict damage every single time the defender purifies a debuff. So that definitely could come in handy. Domino, killer on defense as always. On offense, if you do use her, just make sure you pair it before that special so that if you do place a bleed, it's going to stick. Havoc, you know, he's always been an underrated attacker. Maybe has a small, I think it's going to be a fairly negligible, but it's, you know, some boost to his damage per second because he does inflict some damage if the defender purifies one of his plasmas. Yeah, he was always underrated as an attacker anyway, so I think it just gives him that little bit more, and then he's always going to be an effective defender. Iceman on offense, you know, his cold snap is going to get eaten right off the bat, but his frostbites are passives, and that's where he's getting a lot of his damage now, right? Stack a bunch of frostbites and then throw an L2 to detonate. So if you rank him up, he is going to be an effective attacker in some cases, I think, and he'll have the same defensive value that he's always had. Jubilee I left kind of like partially highlighted here. Maybe she'll be good if you like her. I don't really know her that well. I just know that there's some people who are big fans of her. I see no reason. If you like her in other metas, you'll probably like her in this meta. Kitty definitely will be an MVP, right? She can create her own openings. You can very easily parry before your L1 if you want those incinerates to stick. Maybe you'll have to worry about the incinerate re-triggers getting eaten, but for the most part, she's going to be a beast. Magneto, he also reduces all ability accuracy if he's fighting a metal defender. So even though he's a parry-heavy, primarily style attacker, I do think that he has value because if you're fighting a metal champ, 70% of the time you're going to be able to bypass that Maxichism effect. White Magneto has obviously the pre-fight that allows him to place passive stuns instead of stun debuffs. So that's going to be potentially a very big advantage against you know, champs where you're really wanting to be able to parry. Well, he'll be able to parry at will. Omega Red, again, just like Apocalypse, someone that many people know. When you think Masochism, you think Omega Red. He's able to, via his spores, if he has, I think, 7 or more spores, he can completely prevent defender purification. So, mentioned before about recoil and the fact that some of the people who are going to deal best with this this meta are very recoil friendly. Omega Red is possibly the most recoil hungry champ in the game, right? Him and Ghost. So if he's someone you like a lot, it's someone that you have ranked up, someone that you're going to be wanting to rely heavily on, it may make sense to run recoil. Even if you're not running recoil, I think he will be very effective. Sunspot, a lot of us now have Sunspot as a 7-star. I have, fortunately, he's one of the few good 7 stars that I got, so I'm very happy to have him in my deck. He's going to be a killer, right? He'll use an Infuriate here or there, but he doesn't rely on that Infuriate for damage. He'll be a nuke for sure. Toad does punish purification. In a way, he gains prowess when when the defender purifies. And I think he also has some additional benefit against skills who purify. I think he places passive poison, so his value as an attacker is definitely there, and then he always has his defender value. There are other people here that I didn't mention, but obviously if you have Weapon X, he'll be as effective as he always is. I'm realizing now that there are some champs I didn't mention before, like Jessica Jones. Not a very common champ, but if you have her, yeah, definitely go ahead and include her in your deck. Okay, moving on from Mutant to Tech. Ghost, I already kind of mentioned when I was talking about Omega Red, so just very quickly, yes, she is a very recoil-friendly attacker. Yeah, if you like her, if she's someone that you want to be depending on, it may make sense for you to run recoil. Can still be effective even if you're not running recoil. Guardian, the shock on his L2, where the bulk of his damage comes from, is a debuff. Just make sure you parry before your L2. Idun has surprising, at least to me, I think he has more defensive value than most people think, or at least he has more defensive value than I thought for a long time. As an attacker, he's going to continue to be a bishop nuke and very effective against other mutants. Obviously, with his frequent shock debuffs, that does nerf him a little bit in this meta, but I think he'll still be effective. Still a worthwhile addition to your roster. Mysterio, I think, is going to be... if you haven't ranked up... I'm not saying to rank him up if you don't already have him ranked up. If you already have him ranked up, chances are you're going to include him in your deck anyway because he is usually an annoying defender. I think he becomes just that little bit more annoying in this particular meta, right? He is someone that you want to be able to parry at crucial times, right? If you're waiting out the damage reflection phase of his L1, it's very easy to get in the corner and then you want to be able to parry him at will. So not being able to do that, or when you do parry, having some of those parries turn to regen for him, I think it'll make him that much more effective. Nimrod will continue to be very effective. His shock on his L2 is passive. Penny has the same defensive value that she always has on attack. I think her incinerates are debuffs, but just make sure you parry before the L2. Chakra I don't know much about, but seems like he should be very effective in this meta. I don't think he's hugely reliant on debuffs, or his debuffs are coming at infrequent times and are predictable enough that you can just parry before the moment comes. Stark Spidey, those of us who had him a long time ago probably are familiar with his wall bounce attack I guess strategy. He's by no means the only attacker that can wall bounce, but for whatever reason he seemed to be one of the attackers that people used to do that most frequently with. So from that perspective, you can create your openings while still building up your charges. This is effectively right, and then obviously the shocks on his L2, they are debuffs, so parry before the L2. I think he'll be another very effective nuke to have in your deck. Viv, I just don't know, right? I left her kind of semi-grayed out because I believe she does rely on debuffs for her loop. And from what I read, it seemed like it might be a little bit of a hassle to try and manage those debuffs or prevent those debuffs from getting purified while still having a smooth rotation. But it's possible that I'm wrong, or that the rotation can be easily modified. She certainly has a lot working in her favor, right? She has heal block ability, and she has phase to get easy openings, so she might be someone that actually has more value than I think right now. Warlock, I think, is going to be another MVP. There's one obvious reason and one less obvious reason. So the obvious reason is his heal block. I mentioned at the outset, heal block attackers are going to be very useful. So he has pretty easy access to heal block. It's a passive. You don't have to worry about it possibly getting eaten. The less obvious reason is that when infection is up, he is lowering the offensive ability accuracy of the defender, which means, if you have, I think it's 30% per infection. So if you have an infection up, at least it's at least a little bit beneficial, right? That maybe if you mess up on the L2, maybe your armor break still sticks, right? Or if you have to parry here and there, maybe and an unintentional parry ends up being something that still sticks and doesn't trigger masochism. So definitely someone you want to have in your deck. I think it's going to be a big MVP. Yondu, again, I'm not saying rank him up if you don't already have him ranked up, but he does have access to heal block. There aren't many tech champs that I have highlighted here. So just for the sake of roster depth, right? So maybe someone that you want to include if you're kind of short on techs. I think he could be effective. I skipped over, I'm realizing, because I do have Omega Sentinel semi-grayed out. My problem with Omega Sentinel, and I think it's one that it's a problem that a lot of people have, is that it's somewhat problematic to actually keep her debuffs up. So you can imagine with masochism in the mix, it's going to be that much more difficult to keep her debuffs up. That being said, she is one of the few champs that has that very easy access to heal block. So, if I were redoing this, actually, just thinking about it more, I think I'd actually upgrade her to full color instead of this semi-grayed out. I do think that she's worthwhile including, even though she's probably going to be meaningfully slower than she has been in past metas. Punisher 2099. He has the big armor break off of his L2, just parry before the L2. Once he goes into overdrive, you can very easily keep the defender below a bar of power, which does mean that with a cooperative AI, that means maybe you can continually backdraft, intercept, and get the fight down that much quicker. And then finally, he does also have a heal block that triggers automatically when the defender procs regen. So he might be a very worthwhile inclusion. And then finally, I also skipped over these two guys here. So future Ant-Man, I don't know. He's too new. I do have him, but I just don't have a good feel for yet the fact that it's going to be harder to manage his debuff sticking. Is that going to be too problematic to deal with? I don't know. It's possible that even just with one debuff up, maybe the L2 damage is still going to be big enough that you can get through most defenders. I don't know. Probably worthwhile anyway from a defensive perspective, right? He's new enough that a lot of people don't know quite how to deal with him. Even those who do know how to deal with him, he doesn't have that many counters, right? There's Hulkling and maybe a small handful of other champs that can activate Pierce and deal with him, right? But beyond that, he's problematic enough that I think he's worth including if you have him. And then Howard the Duck. Another champ with a parry-heavy playstyle, but maybe he places enough debuffs that it's still worthwhile, and he does have heal block. So, as I'm kind of talking through it, all of these champs really, Future Ant-Man, Howard the Duck, Omega Sentinel, and Punisher 2099, I think I'd actually upgrade to full color champs that are worthy of inclusion in your deck. And again, Viv Vision very well may be someone who also deserves that. It's just I'm not familiar enough with her to say. Alright, coming down the home stretch, we have Cosmic. Not much to say about Nihilus. If you haven't ranked up, he'll continue to be a fine defender. Cosmic Ghost Rider, it's a little bit more problematic now to manage his loop, but if you can, the payoff is definitely worth it. Gallon's not overly reliant on debuffs, he'll be fine. Gore places lots and lots of debuffs, I think he'll continue to be fine. Gore's an interesting one because he is immune to heal block, which maybe some people won't realize, so maybe you can trick a few people that way. They're planning to use heal block against him and then they get surprised. Yeah, without regen rate modification, if anybody was planning on using other champs to try and reduce his regen rate, well, they're going to get surprised. His regen can get really significant as his health gets low, so he might have some sneaky defensive value. For the most part, if you're talking about playing against really experienced players, they're probably going to be using champs that aren't reliant on heal block or reversing regen, right? Tiger is a classic example. Tiger is going to eat him alive in this meta the same way that she does in any other meta. But again, it's not really that many counters that he has, so definitely potential for you to be able to surprise someone with Gore. Herc will be fine, right? Parry before you try and get your Infuriate up. Hulkling doesn't really care about placing debuffs. Hyperion, yeah, he maybe a few of your Incinerates get eaten, but the advantage of being able to get very easy openings is going to be huge. I think he's a must inclusion. King Groot going to be very tanky, that huge health pool. He has his own regen, which isn't going to be able to get reversed or used in any way against him, right? So he's going to have a lot of defensive value. Offense, if you're using him, most people don't, but there's a few people who like him on offense. He's reliant on those poisons getting played, so just make sure that you parry before you throw that L2. I don't know much about King Groot. From just watching Brian Grant play King Groot, I think the rotation for getting the maximal damage off of that L2 is already a little bit tight, so it might be impractical to actually use him on offense in this meta, but I don't know well enough to say for sure. No, I think I mentioned already that his value as an attacker is definitely going to take a huge hit, right? All of his living abyss debuffs, if you have him duped and at a high sig level, well, that's now meaningless because all of those just are going to get eliminated. You're going to get eaten at the start of the fight. But he'll still have good defensive value. Still a worthwhile addition. Nova, again, always a kind of problematic defender. Go ahead and include him if you have him ranked up. Cersei, sneaky dual threat as always, right? She'll still have all the defensive value that she's always had. As an attacker, I think, based on what I know of her loop, she should be fine, right? Maybe you have to, if you're planning on getting the stun off of the L1, parry before you throw the L1. It's fine. Surfer probably won't make my deck, but people who do like him, well, he'll be effective in this meta. He's not overly reliant on debuffs. You're not going to be relying on his armor breaks, but for the most part, you never really did. In theory, also, if you're desperate, his ability to phase off of the heavy could create openings for you, but I don't think that's going to come into play all that often. And then finally, Terex. Terex could have actually some additional defender value, right? Because it can be easy to get trapped in the corner against him, and then now if you throw in Masochism, some of your parries get eaten. He could do some damage to you. And then some of the champs that I have kind of semi-grayed out. Proxima. She's also someone that, I guess if you've been playing for a long time, maybe you remember that she used to be one of the Masochism counters as well that people would turn to because she reduces offensive ability accuracy of the defender on blocks. That being said, she's outdated as an attacker at this point, right? She's not worth the hassle. If you already have her ranked up and if you like using her, fine. But I don't think I've ever seen anyone use her in Battlegrounds. Venom. Many people have him as a 7-star now. If you do, go ahead and throw him in, right? Yeah, some of his bleeds will get eaten, but 7-star Venom is going to be a powerful attacker. Okay, last class, Mystic class. So here's where a lot more of those examples of defenders who have their own regen are going to come into play. So let's talk about Absman. Absman, you'll hear everybody talk about, oh, he's not really that hard because if you just make sure that you heavy punish his special and alternate the specials that he throws, you can turn off his modes, which means that you're also turning off his massive regen, which is true. My own experience is that trying to focus on playing him exclusively that way leads to a somewhat slow fight unless you're really, really skilled. Most people out there are not really, really skilled. So I think there are a lot of people out there that when they play against Absman, they're counting on some champ that's able to reverse his regen. So that's no longer possible. I think that means that people are going to have a much harder time with Absman than they did before. And I think even for those people who know how to deactivate his modes, it's still going to be a somewhat slower fight. America, I think, is going to be the pain that she always is on defense and still has a lot of offensive value. Black Widow's never going to be the fastest attacker, but her ability to do those nullifies, to place that buff immunity, that's going to be very, very useful to have. Diablo, again, another mostly parry-heavy style attacker, but still one that I think has value, right? Even though those poisons are no longer modifying the regen rate, they're still doing a lot of damage on their own. It's still really easy to stack them up, I think, even with Masochism active. So if he's someone that you like, go ahead and throw him in. Again, another case of if you're running recoil, probably someone that you want to have in your deck. Doom, just like his tech brother, loses a little bit of offensive value because the shocks aren't going to stick, but he'll still be very effective. Nullify ability is going to come into play, and then he'll be the terror that he always is on defense. Semi-grayed out Dragon Man. I was never a big fan of Dragon Man, still am not. I know there are people that are fans of him. If you are, he'll still be effective. If you have a 7-star, definitely include him in your deck. Ebony Maw, he's always been a terror. He's going to be even that much more of a terror because it's always a little bit hard to parry him. Now it'll be that much harder to parry him. Juggernuke will continue to do Juggernuke things. He can also get easy openings with his Unstoppable. Long shot continues to be very effective. Man-Thing will be an effective defender. His regens will get a little bit more effective, although that's not really... I don't think that was ever really a huge aspect of the character. Man-God will continue to be an effective stall defender. Mephisto, his regen wasn't ever able to be modified anyway, at least on paper. That being said, what I always observed was that there are certain champs that it seemed like while he was regenning, he wouldn't regen as much as he should. So it'll be interesting to see, well, with this additional regen rate modification immunity node, does he now proc the full regen every single time? Right? Let me know in the comments if you, well, one, even know what I'm kind of talking about with regards to Mephisto. It's possible that I'm just confused. But number two, if he's going to benefit from this. Mojo will continue to be problematic. Same with Mordo. Rintra, you have to knock him down frequently so that, somewhat reduced access to parry as well as the additional regen. He's got a high health pool. He's going to be that much more annoying of a defender. Sasquatch is very interesting. Sasquatch has that huge regen of his own when he gets below 30%. If you can no longer reverse that, and you have to rely on heal block champs, that really reduces the number of counters for him, right? I'm guessing Torch, even though he can't reverse his healing anymore, will still be able to outdamage the regen. But some of the other people that people used to count on, like Scorpion, I'm not sure. I don't think Scorpion's going to be able to outdamage the regen of a Sasquatch, especially if you have him R5 or R4 even. I do think that he's going to have even more value on defense than he usually does, which is saying a lot because he's always been a very effective defender. Spidey Supreme, in some ways, I guess, probably because not everybody has him, right? But I think in some ways he's underrated. Even though he's someone that scares some people, I also hear a lot of other people say, you know what, I know how to deal with him. But even in Vega's Battlegrounds tournament, where you're talking about the most skilled people in this game, the stats show that Spidey Supreme is a combination of possibly the most, or at least one of the most effective attackers, meaning that he has the highest average score, as well as one of the one or two most effective defenders, meaning that he causes the attacker to have, on average, the lowest score of all options. So, someone that I just ranked up recently, someone that I'm looking forward to putting in my deck. Hood, he'll be very effective nuke. He has, off of his phasing or invisibility, I guess is the proper term for it. He has easier openings than most champs, as well as he does have that stagger, which may be useful. I skipped over Sim Supreme. I do think Sim Supreme is someone who, if you like him, if you know how to use him, this meta, he will be highly effective. He's placing lots and lots of bleed staggers. Some of them will get eaten, but I think he can do some real damage. Same kind of deal with, in a way, I guess, with Scarlet Witch Sigil. That her very easy access to nullify, her ability to do big damage, I think she'll be effective. Possibly I left her grade out because I'm just not 100% sure that she's going to be as effective as a lot of the other people that I have fully highlighted here, but definitely someone to test out. And then finally Wiccan, again, a good neutralize options are always good to have. Alright, so that completes the review of all the different classes. This video went on a lot longer than I intended to. We're coming up on the hour mark, but I hope people found this useful. If nothing else, it was useful for me just to kind of talk through my approach to this meta. I am planning on starting to stream Battlegrounds. I've done a few Battlegrounds streams here and there, just very ad hoc, but I want to at least dabble with, let's say, maybe 2, 3, 4 times a week streaming Battlegrounds. So if I do think of a particular schedule, I'll post that on my community page, and yeah, come join me in the streams. It'll be good to see if we can get a community going. I'd love to chat with some of you. All right, that wraps it up. Good luck in the coming season. See ya.